The librarian was bullying him, but see how he turned it around. The library was supposed to be neutral ground, a sanctuary where knowledge knew no color, creed, or class. But as Marcus Johnson pushed open its heavy glass doors, he could already feel the weight of eyes on him. It wasn't curiosity, it was something colder, something that whispered, "You don't belong here." Behind the front desk sat Mrs. Whitaker, her thin lips curled into a practiced smile that never reached her pale blue eyes. She glanced up briefly, taking in his dark skin, his hoodie, the scuffed sneakers, and dismissed him just as quickly. Marcus ignored the prickling unease at the back of his neck as he approached. He needed study room B for his group project. Deadlines loomed, and this room was the only quiet space left. What he didn't expect was the chill in her voice when she finally spoke. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped, dismissive. "I need to reserve study room B," Marcus replied, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Her smile turned razor-thin. "Oh dear, that room is reserved for serious students only." And just like that, the air shifted. The casual indifference morphed into something sharper, more deliberate, more cruel. Marcus felt his jaw tighten as Mrs. Whitaker's gaze swept over him, slow and deliberate, raking across his hoodie and sneakers like they were evidence of some unspoken crime. Her lips pursed tighter, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "I'm sorry," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, "but all the study rooms are currently reserved for serious students." He blinked, incredulous, glancing at the digital display behind her. Every slot for study room B was wide open. "That's not true," he shot back, his voice rising just enough to draw stares from nearby patrons. "Look at the board. It's free." Mrs. Whitaker didn't even glance at the screen. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, her smile razor-thin. "Well, dear, technology isn't always reliable. Besides," she added, her voice laced with venomous sweetness, "these rooms are meant for people who truly value their education, not someone who might waste the space." The words hit like a slap. Waste the space. As if his very presence polluted the pristine aisles of books. Marcus clenched his fists, heat rushing to his cheeks. Around him, whispers rippled through the room, judgmental, smug. The kind that said, "We knew it." And then came the final blow. "Why don't you go sit in the corner? There's plenty of tables. Unless, of course, you're planning to blast music or cause trouble." Trouble. The word hung heavy, accusatory. This wasn't about a room anymore. It was about exclusion, humiliation, hate. Marcus turned away, his fists trembling at his sides, and retreated to a corner table. He dropped into a chair, his backpack thudding against the floor. The library seemed smaller now, its quiet hum suffocating. Every glance from other patrons felt like judgment, like they knew exactly why he was sitting there instead of in the study room he'd been denied. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through messages from his group chat. His friends were counting on him to finish their project slides by tonight. They needed that quiet space. But now he was stuck here, surrounded by whispers and sideways glances, his pride shredded. His thumb hovered over his dad's name and his contacts list. Should he call? No, he couldn't bother his father. Not when he was always busy with work. Marcus wanted to handle this himself. He wasn't some kid who needed his daddy to fight his battles for him. Still, the thought lingered. As the minutes dragged on, a group of white teenagers sauntered past him, laughing loudly enough to draw annoyed looks from nearby readers. One of them, a lanky boy with shaggy blonde hair, shot Marcus a smirk before heading straight to the front desk. Through gritted teeth, Marcus watched as Mrs. Whitaker greeted them warmly, her voice dripping with honeyed politeness. "Oh, hello there. Are you boys looking for a study room?" she asked, her tone light and cheerful, a stark contrast to how she'd spoken to him earlier. "Yeah, we've got a project due tomorrow," the blonde boy replied, barely concealing his grin. "Think we can grab one?" Mrs. Whitaker tapped at her keyboard, then beamed. "Of course. Study room B is free right now. Just sign here." Marcus's vision blurred with rage. There it was, the proof he didn't want but couldn't ignore. The blatant hypocrisy, the injustice. But then something unexpected happened. As the boys passed by his table, the blonde one paused, leaning down close enough for Marcus to smell the faint tang of cologne mixed with stale coffee. "Hey," the boy said, smirking again. "You sure you don't want to join us?" "Oh, wait." He glanced pointedly at Marcus's hoodie and sneakers. "Never mind. Guess you're not serious enough." The laughter that followed cut deeper than any insult Marcus had ever endured. For a split second, he considered lunging out of his seat, grabbing the boy by the collar, and demanding an apology. But he stopped himself. Violence wouldn't solve anything. It would only give Mrs. Whitaker another reason to label him as trouble. Instead, Marcus leaned back in his chair, forcing himself to breathe deeply. He closed his eyes, replaying the scene in his mind. The librarian's dismissive tone, the digital display showing empty rooms, the way she'd practically rolled out the red carpet for those boys. Something about it all felt calculated, intentional, like she'd been expecting him, or someone like him, to show up and ask for help, only to shut him down the moment he did. And then it hit him. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't even about the study room. It was bigger than that. It was systemic, institutional, the kind of racism that hid behind rules and procedures, masquerading as fairness while systematically excluding people like him. A spark ignited within Marcus, a quiet determination that burned hotter than his initial anger. Fine. If she wanted to play games, he could play too. But first, he needed backup. Someone who could level the playing field. Someone who could expose the truth. With a shaky exhale, Marcus unlocked his phone again and dialed his father's number. This time, he didn't hesitate. "Dad," he said when the call connected, his voice low but steady. "I need your help." The library doors swung open, and Marcus looked up to see his father stride in. James Johnson was an imposing figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a navy suit that commanded respect. Heads turned as he entered, whispers rippling through the room. Marcus stood quickly, his heart pounding. "Dad," he said softly, stepping forward. "You didn't have to come." James placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "Of course I did. No one treats my family like that." His voice was calm, but carried an edge that silenced nearby murmurs. Mrs. Whitaker froze behind the desk, her clipboard trembling slightly. Recognition dawned on her face as James approached. "Mrs. Whitaker," he said smoothly, his tone polite but unyielding. "I believe you've met my son, Marcus." Her smile faltered. "Councilman Johnson, what a pleasant surprise. Is there something I can help you with?" James tilted his head, his dark eyes narrowing. "Yes. My son tells me he was denied access to study room B earlier today. He assured me it was available at the time, yet you claimed otherwise." Mrs. Whitaker blinked rapidly, clearly caught off guard. She glanced briefly at Marcus, then back at James, her cheeks flushing pink. "Well, I'm sure there must be some misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding?" James interrupted, his voice sharpening slightly. The air grew tense as everyone watched, waiting for what came next. James didn't wait for her to finish. He leaned slightly over the counter, his towering frame and commanding presence forcing Mrs. Whitaker to take a step back. "Let's not play games," he said, his voice low, but carrying enough weight to silence the entire library. "You told my son the room was reserved for serious students. Care to explain what that means?" Mrs. Whitaker stammered, clutching the edge of the desk as if it might steady her. I only meant that these rooms are for students who truly need them. We have guidelines." "Guidelines?" James interrupted again, his tone sharper now. "Or biases? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like your so-called guidelines are just a cover for something far uglier." The librarian's face flushed crimson, her hands trembling visibly. She glanced around the room, perhaps hoping for support from her colleagues or patrons, but no one spoke up. Instead, all eyes were fixed on the unfolding confrontation. Even the teenagers who had mocked Marcus earlier were now watching silently, their smirks replaced with uneasy expressions. Marcus stood beside his father, feeling a mix of vindication and awe. For years, he'd watched his dad navigate situations like this, calm, calculated, yet unrelenting in his pursuit of justice. But seeing it firsthand, especially here, in this space that had once felt so unwelcoming, filled him with a quiet pride. James turned slightly, addressing the growing audience of onlookers. "This isn't just about my son," he said, his voice rising just enough to carry across the room. "It's about accountability. It's about ensuring that institutions like this one serve everyone equally, not just those who look a certain way or come from certain backgrounds." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Whitaker seemed to shrink under the weight of James's words, her carefully constructed facade crumbling. "And let's be clear," James continued, turning back to her. "If I find out that this library has been operating under discriminatory practices, there will be consequences. Serious ones." The threat hung in the air, unmistakable and final. Mrs. Whitaker opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down at her clipboard, her knuckles white from gripping it too tightly. For the first time since Marcus had walked into the library, the balance of power had shifted. The woman who had dismissed him so casually now seemed small, exposed. Marcus felt a surge of satisfaction, but also clarity. This wasn't just about revenge or proving a point. It was about exposing the truth, about holding people accountable for their actions. And as he watched his father stand firm, he realized something else. This fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. James straightened, glancing down at Marcus with a faint smile. "Let's go, son. We'll make sure this gets resolved." As they turned to leave, the whispers in the library grew louder, the tension palpable. Whatever happened next, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same. James paused near the library's exit, his hand resting on the doorframe as he glanced back at Mrs. Whitaker. "Oh, and one more thing," he said, his voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "You may think this is just about Study Room B or my son, but you'd be wrong." The librarian's face paled further, her grip on the clipboard tightening until her knuckles turned white. Around them, patrons leaned in slightly, eager to hear what came next. Even the teenagers who had mocked Marcus earlier were now watching intently, their earlier bravado replaced with unease. James stepped closer to the desk again, his presence filling the room. "I've been doing some digging over the past few months," he continued, his tone calm but laced with authority. "Did you know that complaints about unequal treatment here aren't exactly new? In fact, there's a pattern. Students of color being denied access to resources, told they're not serious enough, while others waltz right in without issue." Mrs. Whitaker's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no words came out. Her eyes darted toward her colleagues behind the counter, silently pleading for help, but none of them met her gaze. Instead, they busied themselves with paperwork or pretended not to listen, guilt etched across their faces. Marcus watched, stunned. He hadn't known about the other complaints or his father's investigation, but it made sense now. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was systemic, institutional. And James Johnson wasn't just here to defend his son. He was here to dismantle the system that allowed this kind of discrimination to thrive. "I've already spoken to the city manager," James added, his voice dropping lower, though it still carried across the room. "And I'll be requesting a full audit of this library's policies and practices. Every reservation record, every complaint filed, everything. If there's even a hint of bias, and based on what I've seen so far, I'm certain there is, you can bet there will be consequences." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Some patrons exchanged knowing looks, while others whispered urgently to one another. The atmosphere shifted, charged with both fear and hope. For years, many had suspected something was off about how the library operated, but no one had dared to speak up, until now. Mrs. Whitaker finally found her voice, though it cracked under the strain. "Councilman, please, surely we can resolve this privately." "No," James interrupted firmly. "This isn't about privacy. It's about transparency, accountability, justice." He turned to address the room, his voice rising slightly. "For too long, people like you have hidden behind rules and procedures to justify discrimination. Well, those days are over. Starting today, things change." The finality in his words sent a shiver through the room. Mrs. Whitaker seemed to deflate, sinking into her chair, as if the weight of his declaration had crushed her completely. Tears welled in her eyes, but no one moved to comfort her, not even her co-workers. Marcus felt a surge of pride swell in his chest, as he looked up at his father. This wasn't just about vindication anymore. It was about exposing the truth and demanding better. For him, for others like him, and for anyone who might walk through those doors in the future. As they stepped outside, the cool evening air greeted them. Marcus exhaled deeply, feeling lighter than he had all day. "Dad," he said softly, glancing up at James, "you didn't tell me you were working on this." James smiled faintly, placing a reassuring hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Sometimes, the best way to fight a battle is to let your opponent underestimate you. Now let's go home. We got work to do." The next morning, the library was abuzz with hushed whispers and nervous energy. News of Councilman James Johnson's confrontation with Mrs. Whitaker had spread like wildfire, fueled by social media posts from witnesses who'd overheard the exchange. By the time Marcus arrived, this time flanked by his father, the atmosphere inside was electric, charged with anticipation. James strode in first, his suit immaculate, his posture commanding. Marcus followed close behind, his head held high despite the knot of anxiety still lingering in his chest. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about every student who'd ever been turned away, dismissed, or humiliated in this very space. And today, they were going to make sure everyone knew it. At the front desk, Mrs. Whitaker sat stiffly, her usual smug demeanor replaced with visible unease. Her hands trembled as she shuffled papers, avoiding eye contact with anyone who approached. When she saw James and Marcus heading her way, her face went pale, and she instinctively stood, clutching the edge of the counter for support. "Councilman Johnson," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I didn't mean—" "You didn't mean what?" James interrupted, his tone sharp but controlled. "To discriminate? To deny my son access based on nothing more than the color of his skin? Because that's exactly what you did." Mrs. Whitaker opened her mouth to respond, but James raised a hand, silencing her. He turned to address the growing crowd of patrons who had gathered nearby, drawn by curiosity, or perhaps solidarity. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice ringing clear across the room, "yesterday, my son was denied access to a study room in this library because someone decided he wasn't serious enough. But let me tell you something. Marcus is one of the most dedicated students I know. He works hard, he respects others, and he deserves the same opportunities as anyone else in this city." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Some nodded vigorously, others clapped softly, emboldened by James's words. Marcus felt a lump rise in his throat, overwhelmed by the sudden swell of support. James turned back to Mrs. Whitaker, his expression unyielding. "Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an investigation into your conduct and the practices of this institution. Furthermore, I've arranged for an independent auditor to review all policies and procedures to ensure fairness moving forward." Gasps erupted around the room. Mrs. Whitaker staggered backward, tears streaming down her face. "You can't do this," she cried, her voice breaking. "I've worked here for 20 years. And in those 20 years, James replied, his voice cold and final, you've had countless chances to do better. Instead, you chose prejudice over progress. That ends now." As two supervisors appeared to escort Mrs. Whitaker out, the room fell silent except for the soft shuffle of footsteps and murmured conversations. Marcus watched her go, feeling not triumph, but relief and resolve. The fight wasn't over, but this was a start. James placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, pulling him aside. "How are you holding up?" he asked quietly. Marcus exhaled, meeting his father's gaze. "I'm okay. Better than okay, actually, thanks to you." James smiled faintly, pride shining in his eyes. "This is just the beginning, son. Change doesn't happen overnight. But together, we'll keep pushing until it sticks." By mid-afternoon, news of Mrs. Whitaker's suspension had spread beyond the library walls, igniting conversations across the city. Social media posts detailing the incident went viral, with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #EqualAccess trending locally. Students, parents, and community leaders voiced their outrage and their support, turning what had started as a personal affront into a rallying cry for systemic change. Inside the library, the mood was quieter, but no less charged. Staff members moved about cautiously, avoiding eye contact with patrons who lingered near the front desk, whispering among themselves. The digital display, showing study room availability, had been updated to include a new notice. All rooms are available on a first-come, first-served basis. No exceptions. Marcus sat at a table near the entrance, his laptop open in front of him, though he wasn't focused on his project. Instead, he watched as people entered the library, many glancing toward the now empty front desk where Mrs. Whitaker had once reigned supreme. Some offered Marcus knowing smiles or nods of encouragement. Others simply went about their business, perhaps unaware of the storm that had passed through these halls just hours earlier. James joined him after finishing a call with the city manager. "The auditor will be here by Monday," he said, sliding into the chair across from Marcus. "They'll review everything: reservation logs, complaint records, staff conduct. If there's even a hint of bias, we'll root it out." Marcus nodded, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. Relief, pride, but also a lingering sadness. "Do you think it'll make a difference?" he asked quietly. "I mean, really?" James leaned back, his expression thoughtful. "It won't fix everything overnight. People like her, they don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of a system that lets them get away with this kind of behavior. But exposing the truth is the first step. Holding her accountable sends a message. No one is untouchable." Marcus looked down at his hands, thinking about all the students who might walk into this library in the future. Would they feel welcome, respected? Or would they face the same barriers he had, only subtler, harder to prove? As if reading his thoughts, James added, "This fight doesn't end here. There will always be more work to do. But today, we showed people that speaking up matters, that standing together matters." A group of teenagers approached, hesitating before one of them, a girl with braids and a shy smile, spoke up. "Hey, we just wanted to say thanks for what you did. It kind of makes us feel like maybe things can change." Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected gratitude. "Yeah," he said finally, returning her smile. "Maybe they can." When the group walked away, Marcus turned back to his father, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. That evening, Marcus and James sat together at the kitchen table, the remnants of dinner scattered between them. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the overhead light and the occasional creak of settling wood. For a moment, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The weight of the day hung in the air, shared but unspoken. Finally, James broke the silence. "You did good today," he said, his voice warm with pride. "Not just standing up for yourself, but seeing the bigger picture. That takes courage." Marcus looked up from the notebook he'd been doodling in, surprised by the compliment. "I couldn't have done it without you," he admitted. "If you hadn't shown up." "But I did," James interrupted gently. "And so did you. Don't forget that. You didn't back down when it mattered most. That's what makes you strong." Marcus nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. He thought about the library, the confrontation, the way people had rallied around him, not just because of who his father was, but because they believed in fairness, in justice. It gave him hope, even as he knew the fight wasn't over. "I want to keep going," Marcus said after a pause, his voice firm despite the uncertainty still lingering in his chest. "With the audit, the changes, I want to be part of it, to make sure this doesn't happen again." James smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his son's shoulder. "I wouldn't expect anything less. But remember, change doesn't happen all at once. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and you don't have to carry the weight alone." Marcus returned the smile, feeling a warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with the coffee mug cradled in his hands. For the first time in days, the knot of anger and frustration that had tightened around his heart began to loosen. This wasn't the end, it was a beginning. As they cleared the dishes together, Marcus glanced out the window at the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, students were studying, dreaming, fighting their own battles. And maybe, just maybe, the world was starting to listen. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to bully you or take advantage of you? We would love to hear your stories and how you handled it. Share your experiences in the comments below. If you enjoyed this and want more content on inspiring Black stories channel like this, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Thanks for watching. And remember, courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act despite it.